with a compelling perspective on global politics. This is the Patrick Henningsen Show on TNT Radio.
That's a campaign promise.
Tell us the truth. Tell us the truth.
We mandate that the truth be told.
You're hearing it.
TNT.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We're in the final segment of the final hour of this broadcast today on Thursday, and I'm very pleased to welcome onto the stage longtime Republican strategist, New York Times bestselling author, and host of the StoneZone, excellent political program. Roger Stone's joining us on the line right now. Roger, welcome to the show.
I'm delighted to be here.
Roger, I just want to say it's an absolute honor to speak to you, and I'm glad that you're active in this election cycle. It is the strangest election cycle, Roger, in my lifetime. I don't know if you agree. A lot of people say this doesn't feel like an election. I want to talk about that, what your thoughts are on 2024, and also this lawfare against Donald Trump is kind of spun out of control. Looks like it's backfiring. I want to get your thoughts on all of this. How do you think this is shaping up?
Well, what you said initially is absolutely correct. It's unlike any other presidential election that I have seen. And of course, I've been involved at a junior or senior level in 13 national Republican presidential campaigns. I mean, there's a backlash in the country against the disastrous effects of the Biden administration policies, whether it is gasoline prices, food prices, inflation, the fact that we have an invasion on our southern border, which is causing a fentanyl crisis, a crime crisis, a fiscal crisis, as cities and counties across the country threaten to go broke because a law requires them to pay for social services for illegals, even if they have to cut social services or services on American taxpayers. Meanwhile, the country is on the precipice of World War III. Secretary of State Blinken says that in September that Ukraine will join NATO, which is a violation, of course, of the Budapest Memorandum that we signed with the Russians. It's a violation of the Minsk Accords. We're violating treaties that we signed with the Russians to mount missiles in Ukraine pointed at Russia, which Putin has made clear is a line in the sand for him. So I think there's a very negative reaction in the country. Oddly enough, it's counterintuitive, but Donald Trump's candidacy has been turbocharged by these over-the-top and I think extraordinarily transparent efforts to jam him up in criminal indictments when they had to go fabricate crimes. They are desperately afraid that he is on his way to returning to the White House, and he poses an existential threat to the neocon policies that are slowly but surely destroying the country.
And the lawfare is pretty shocking, Roger, even by like South and Latin American dictatorial banana republic standards. This is like totally out of control to have this many cases stacked up and timed to coincide with the primaries. There were attempts to keep Donald Trump off the ballot in some states because he was accused of things. You were on the front line of this lawfare, and I'm going to say the case against you is one of the gravest miscarriages of justice that I ever saw up to that date. To fabricate, some story about you being a go-between with the Russians and WikiLeaks, a ridiculous case, but yet they managed to put together a jury and a judge to push that one through. Totally ridiculous on its face, but this is all connected, isn't it, Roger? You're actually the sort of catalyst. That story that they tried to place you in, that was one of the linchpins for the whole Russiagate myth. You actually wrote a best-selling book on this, didn't you?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There was no evidence that there ever was an online hack of the Democratic National Committee by Russian intelligence or anybody else for that matter. They admitted, interestingly enough, when BuzzFeed, now out of business, a liberal rag, sued to get Robert Mueller's, the special counsel's final long hidden, long redacted final report unsealed, he himself admitted that he had found no evidence of Russian collusion, WikiLeaks collaboration, or any other crime on my part. So then what did I lie to Congress about? What would have been my motive to lie? There was no underlying crime to lie about. No, I was prosecuted because after Mueller and his associates spent $30 million with unlimited legal authority, with unlimited manpower, with an unlimited budget, couldn't find any evidence of Russian collusion on the part of Donald Trump or his campaign. So they sought to fabricate it. They pressured me to testify falsely against the president regarding some 29 phone conversations we'd had in 2016, which I refused to do. I'd already passed polygraph tests, multiple ones, proving that all of that was a lie, not admissible in court, but the FBI uses them regularly. So it is, I guess I was an early test case, but now this is an absurdity. So we're going to prosecute Donald Trump in Florida, but we presented the evidence to charge him to a grand jury in DC, but we're prosecuting him in Florida for retaining certain classified and top secret documents, which the president argues under the Presidential Records Act he was entitled to do. But we know for a certainty that as vice president and a U.S. senator, Joe Biden illegally and willfully retained top secret and classified documents, but he's not being prosecuted. Therein is one of the great examples of the two-tiered justice system. Now we're about to go to trial in New York for a case that the federal prosecutors passed on because they didn't think it had merit. At worst, this is a business records civil case, if it's that, but we bumped it up to be a criminal trial in which the two main accusers of Donald Trump have both testified and written that he didn't make payments to buy anyone's silence. They now have changed their stories. The judge in this case is given a contribution to Joe Biden's reelection, which should eliminate him as the judge immediately. And now we've learned that his daughter, who's an adult, is a Democratic political operative. She's raised $93 million for her Democrat clients using this trial as the hook for her fundraising, an egregious conflict of interest. There's no chance that judge, of course, will recuse himself. That's, by the way, would be certainly strong grounds for appeal. But see, they don't care about the ultimate result. The idea is just to get a conviction, some conviction, any conviction of Donald Trump before the election, because as the president says, this is all election interference.
No, this is beyond conflicts of interest, Roger. We're at the level of political racketeering. If you look at how well organized this is, and how the overlaps of the political establishment with the judiciary, the weaponization of the Department of Justice, of Attorney Generals, Letitia James herself in New York is on record saying she's going to get Donald Trump, and yet she's allowed to run point on one of these high-profile cases. I mean, this would have, look back in your experience, Roger, you've seen the decades. And would this, at what point in history in the timeline has this become allowable? Because this would have been thrown out or no one would touch it just 10 years ago, 15 years ago. When did it all change?
I think this weaponization is you're right, it is fairly new. Look, when there was a media monopoly, when outlets like TNT Radio didn't exist, when there was no internet, it was very easy to bring down Richard Nixon, whose crimes now look like small potatoes compared to the abuse of power by the Obama administration. But there was no place Nixon could go to mount a defense. We had three networks. They were against him. We had no national newspapers. The Washington Post and New York Times were not yet national newspapers. The news magazines like Time and Newsweek were enormously powerful and influential, but there was no place he could go to mount a defense. Yet you look at the alleged crimes, and they really seem rather minor. Here, in the case of the Russian collusion hoax, for example, this is an abuse of power in which the full authority of the United States government and the extraordinary capability of our intelligence agencies is utilizing what they know is completely fabricated evidence to mount an illegal coup to take down a duly elected president. It's used to justify FISA warrants, to spy on Donald Trump's associates. It's used to appoint, as a justification, to appoint a special counsel based on what evidence? Certainly not the probably not the hack of the Democratic National Committee, because the forensic evidence would indicate that actually never happened, nor the Steele dossier, this falsified report that claims that Donald Trump cavorted with prostitutes in Moscow when he was a private citizen. The progenitors of the Russian collusion hoax know that all of that is nonsense, but they use it anyway to try to take down Donald Trump.
One of the big tragedies, and maybe this was intended, Roger, but the whole Russia collusion hoax, which you outlined incredibly well in your best-selling book, The Myth of Russian Collusion, New York Times bestseller. Roger, it helped to formulate foreign policy. That's the frightening part, is it provided that sort of bed of American belief. At least half the country believed that the Russians installed Donald Trump into the White House by nefarious means in 2016. That might sound like a crazy conspiracy theory, but I'm faced with people on a daily basis that still believe that happened, Roger, despite the fact you and everyone else has debunked it. And it's affecting our foreign policy, and it's put us in this position, as you said initially, where we're facing a potential third world war. How did we get here?
Look, I think you're absolutely right. Here's the thing about the left. It doesn't matter how debunked, disproved, or discredited any of their BS is. If you just wait a few days, they'll come back and recycle it all back through again. So I'll give you an example. Paul Manafort, Donald Trump's campaign manager, shared polling information with a Russian intelligence asset, who in turn most likely shared it with Putin. Well, first of all, the Trump campaign had no proprietary polling information. They hadn't polled yet. And the man in question, Konstantin Kalemnik, I think is Matt Taibbi, the independent journalist, certainly no conservative or Republican, is proved was actually a U.S. intelligence asset. So that whole narrative is entirely false. Or the idea that I was a cutout between WikiLeaks, the Russians, and the Trump campaign. No evidence of that ever produced. In fact, only because BuzzFeed sued the Justice Department on Election Day, November 3rd, 2020 at midnight. Strange time for a press release, wouldn't you say? They're forced to release the last remaining unredacted version of Robert Mueller's final report, in which he admits that he'd found no evidence of Russian collusion, WikiLeaks collaboration, or any other crime on my part. But as Ray Donovan, who was the Secretary of Labor under Ronald Reagan, who was vilified in a phony witch hunt corruption scandal, later exonerated, where do you go to get your good name back? The distortion and smear is the name of the game.
And, you know, a lot of people will be accusing the current president, Joe Biden, of, executing U.S. foreign policy in order to cover up possibly his own past involvement or indiscretions as they relate to Ukraine, his son Hunter Biden, their business dealings internationally, and that he could possibly be blackmailed, perhaps, for whatever they're doing overseas over those years. I mean, there's a lot of receipts that point in this direction, especially right now, with some of the things that have come out into the public domain recently. Roger, is it possible that you could have a U.S. president who's compromised at a level, and this is like a real compromised situation, not the mythical one that they said Donald Trump was being blackmailed by the Russians? You actually have the potential here for, let's say, the Zelensky government to be leaning on the Biden administration because of tapes or other evidence of Biden corruption in Ukraine. Is this a possibility?
I think it is, based on what we've seen, it's highly likely, or it's no different than Chinese interests giving six figures to the University of Pennsylvania, who turns around and pays it to Joe Biden to be a professor for a class that he never actually teaches. Yet another example of this administration being compromised. Yet there are Republicans in the House who don't seem to have the belly for impeachment. I mean, there's far more evidence today that we've already seen that is very real. It's not speculative, to justify articles of impeachment against Joe Biden, far more than we ever had in the two articles of impeachment that were voted against Donald Trump. And as you point out, the second impeachment about Ukraine, where they essentially impeached Trump for a conversation that he has with Zelensky, in which he's trying to root out corruption, is really designed to cover up the fact that it was Joe Biden who basically threatened to withhold federal funds, U.S. funds from Ukraine, unless they fired a prosecutor who was investigating who? Hunter Biden and his business connection with Burisma. So look, this is for the full use of Alinsky's rules for radicals. Okay, anything they accuse Trump of, anything they accuse Trump's supporters of, is exactly what they themselves are doing. Vice President Kamala Harris has a post on X, formerly known as Twitter, this week, and she says, if Donald Trump is elected, he will use the DOJ, he will weaponize the DOJ against his political opponents. Does this woman have no self-awareness whatsoever?
No, well, we're at that point, Roger, where if a new administration came in, I think a lot of people, admittedly, definitely on the right side of the aisle, but even some on the left would say that there's a deep, deep corruption or politicization of the FBI, of the DOJ, just as two major agencies. You could extend that to other agencies. I'm sure you could probably comment on that, but just on that basis, there would have to be a clean out. Because it's so systemic at this point. We're seeing it manifesting to the point where it's interfering with a general presidential election. I mean, that's a crisis moment for the country. So if Donald Trump was elected and he cleared house and fired everybody, appointed new people, and got rid of the corruption right down the ranks, you know that the Democrats and the media would cry fascism at that point. They would say he's weaponized the executive branch or whatever. But how did we get to this point? We got to this point because of politicization of these agencies. Your thoughts?
I mean, look, just yesterday we saw John Brennan saying that, warning us that Donald Trump has already made an agreement with Vladimir Putin that he can have all of Ukraine. This is the same John Brennan who was an admitted communist, who approved the visa of four of the hijackers who attacked America on 9/11 when he was the station chief in Rida. The same John Brennan who at least one FBI counterterrorism expert and one former CIA counterterrorism expert have come forward to say converted to radical Islam, to Wahhabism, when he was the station chief. The same John Brennan who claimed that Hunter Biden's laptop was Russian disinformation, and who, based on Special Counsel John Durham's report, was one of the major architects of the false claim that Donald Trump had Russian assistance in his election. So he's right back at it again with the same recycled disinformation. The people who are a threat to democracy, or more specifically, the people who are a threat to our constitutional republic, are the Biden administration and his deep state puppeteers who will now continue to accuse us of exactly what they are doing. What could be less democratic, or I should say more anti-democratic, than trying to keep Donald Trump off the ballot? What could be more anti-democratic than trying to censor people's speech on social media platforms and on the internet? What could be more anti-democratic than charging your opponents with crimes this close to an election? If you were going to charge Donald Trump with crimes in connection with January 6th, why didn't they do it in 2021? Why are they doing it now? Because they're losing. That's why.
No, it's a pretty obvious case. Unfortunately, we have to deal with this as the train is moving down the track towards November 2024. All this stuff is having to be sorted out along the way. And let's talk about 2024 for the remaining minutes that we have, Roger. What do you see happening? Because it's like I've never seen a Democratic incumbent polling so low with so little support from his own party, let alone moderates and independents, than Joe Biden. Is he going to be replaced? I know you talked earlier in the media about the Michelle Obama possibility. Have you had any updates in your thinking on how they're going to manage this? Because it's not looking good from a polling point of view for
Look,
Biden.
I think the leaders of the Democratic Party, the leaders of the government media cabal, are increasingly aware of the fact that Joe's not reelectable based on his inability to string together a sentence. Yesterday, when asked about his legacy, he seemed to take credit for ending the war in Vietnam. Then he went on to say peacemaker would be his legacy. This is the guy who was on the verge of walking us into World War III in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and the same guy who is funding both sides of the conflict in the Middle East. So they know he is not electable based on not only his own inability to perform as a candidate, never mind a president, but also based on the disastrous impact of his policies: gasoline prices, food shortages, epic inflation, the migrant invasion, which is giving us a fentanyl crisis, a crime crisis, a fiscal crisis, as local governments struggle to provide social services for illegals, having to cut social services and other services on U.S. taxpayers. Now you add to that the burgeoning corruption of the Biden crime family, and you only have to reach the inexorable conclusion that Joe is not reelectable. So I still believe that he will. They've cleared the field for him, so he'll garner enough delegates to be nominated. But I think on the eve of their convention, I still believe that he will be pressured, perhaps with the threat of removal under the 25th Amendment by his Democrat colleagues, to announce that not that he's stepping down, but that he is simply not running again. That means he would retain the authority to pardon himself, his brother, his son, and other members of the Biden crime family before he leaves. And at that point, he could release his delegates. And if the convention worked its will, and selected the most popular Democrat in the country, well, that would be Michelle Obama. I saw Joe Rogan essentially say this yesterday. Thank you very much, Joe. I said that 2 years ago. But yeah, I still think it's entirely possible. Now, Biden, I think, is determined to stay. Dr. Jill is particularly determined to stay. You saw that angry press conference he did when the special counsel concluded that he had very definitely, willfully, illegally retained documents he was never supposed to have. He said that he was the best qualified person in the country to be president. And who could do what he's done? Indeed, who could? Who could destroy the most robust economy in our country's history? Who could bring us from having no new foreign wars under Donald Trump to the brink of two wars around the globe? Who could give us this kind of spending and thus this kind of rate of inflation? So he's very stubborn. He does have that one quality. He's been wrong on every major foreign policy issue since he first came to the Senate, but he's extraordinarily stubborn. He sees himself as a Kennedy. He thinks the poll numbers are wrong. You saw how his wife reacted on, I think it was The View the other day, when they said, your husband's behind in this. No, he's not. She said he's going to win. Well, what do they know that we don't know?
Well, that brings up a question about the election integrity problems that we had in 2020 and in 2022. In my home state of Arizona, Carrie Lake clearly was, I'm going to say it, she was robbed of her gubernatorial seat in that election. Have these issues been resolved, Roger? Just what are your feelings on that? Because this is still a hanging chad for the country.
Yeah, no, they have not been resolved. Therein lies a giant problem. The Republican National Committee for the last 3 years, which has certainly had the resources, done nothing in terms of challenging in court or going into state legislatures to try to guarantee a free, fair, transparent election. You've had some minor reforms in Wisconsin. I think they did away with drop boxes, but by and large, the same post-COVID-19 induced laws that were in place for the last election are still in place. And we're now working against the clock. the voter lists in almost all these states are very dirty. I was in Nevada not long ago, and I was speaking, and a man showed me 5 ballots. This was before the last election, I guess. And I said, what are those? He says, well, these are 5 ballots mailed to the place I live. I said, well, who? I don't get it. He said, well, one of them's addressed to me. The other 4 are addressed to people who once rented my apartment. And I said, well, where are they? He said, well, 2 of them are dead, and the other 2 moved out of state, and one of them has been gone for 15 years. Gives you a perfect example. That's true. That's true in Florida as well, and many other states. The voter laws, the voter rolls need to be clean. We're not trying to disenfranchise any real person who's eligible to run. That's not what I'm saying. But no, I think the election machinery has not been updated. There's the real possibility of the same kind of fraud that existed in the last election. There is no place in the country where the fraud is more outrageous and more provable than in Arizona. 59% of the polling places in Maricopa County are not operating properly on election day, and they just disproportionately, coincidentally, happen to be the most heavily Republican precincts. Please give me a break.
And lastly, before we go, Roger, I appreciate your time. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you about these issues. Donald Trump's vice presidential pick, he is running away in the polls, at least on the Republican side, but could a strategic VP pick win back some of that middle ground or white suburban women, housewives, those key demographics that you do need to win a national election? Some names have been kicked around. Kristi Noem, Ben Carson's name has been coming up. Do you have any preference or any thoughts on this before we break?
Well, first of all, there's actually no historical precedent for the vice presidential candidate actually making a positive difference in a presidential campaign. President Richard Nixon once told me, when looking for a vice presidential running mate, don't look for someone who can help you. Just try to find someone who doesn't hurt you. That may be a little cynical, but I think there are several criteria here. First of all, you need someone who the American people can look at and say, yes, that person has the experience, the judgment, the temperament, the capability to be president, if God forbid that should become necessary. Secondarily, you want somebody whose policy views are completely copacetic with Donald Trump on the border, on war and peace issues, on the Second Amendment, on abortion, on every major issue that will come up in this campaign. Then I think you can start looking at the political considerations. You need somebody who is sure-footed, somebody who has enough experience in campaigning, they're not going to make rookie mistakes. The idea of trying to pick somebody who appeals to a specific constituency, well, the candidate who would get us the most black votes is Donald Trump. The candidate who's getting us the most Hispanic votes is Donald Trump. An argument could be made for a woman candidate. The Democrats will have one way or another, in my view. I've been criticized by some, but I like Tulsi Gabbard when it comes to war, abortion, guns, and the border. She's solid. Yeah, she was a Democrat. Ronald Reagan was a Democrat. We need some Democrat votes to win, but there are other very good candidates potentially. I like Devin Nunes, 20 years in the House, chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, was a dairy farmer before he went to Congress. Tough as nails, experienced, sure-footed, knows the Russian nonsense inside and out. Upstate New York Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, who's shown enormous courage in criticizing the weaponization of the Department of Justice, filing formal complaints against judges and so on. Just to name 3. I'm not endorsing anyone. I'm for whoever Donald Trump is for. But I think above all, we need someone who meets those criteria.
No, thank you very much for that. Great to have your thoughts on that. A lot of people are thinking about that at the moment. Roger Stone, longtime political consultant, best-selling author, host of the StoneZone, highly recommended program. Thank you for joining us on TNT this week.
Happy to be with you.
There he goes, ladies and gentlemen. That is Roger Stone. Fantastic segment. Look, big thank you to everybody. Basil Valentine and Arnaud Devolay, author of Foreign Entanglements. Great book on Biden corruption in Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you same time, same place tomorrow. Take care. All the best.